Behind the cis-story of sex and gender. The cis-story of the development of the concepts of sex and gender in the United States goes something like this. In the 1950s and 60s, three highly influential, and from the perspective of the present, profoundly controversial figures transformed dominant Western understandings of sex, gender, and sexuality, providing the epistemic foundations for contemporary knowledges. These founding fathers of the at the time new concept of gender were John Money, Harry Benjamin, and Robert Stoller. Through their often extremely damaging work on intersex and trans patients at the early gender identity clinics in the United States, these sexologists established distinctions between sex, gender, and sexuality that became the benchmark for trans medicine in the 1960s and got taken up as a clinical standard in the 1970s. The impact of their theories, published in books such as Benjamin's 1966 The Transsexual Phenomenon, Stoller's 1968 Sex and Gender, and Green and Money's 1969 Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment, was that transness became understood and scripted as heterosexuality, expert authority was attached to doctors, and transness was both socially recognised and pathologized. In the 1970s, at the same time as many trans individuals were placing their faith in this science to provide answers and surgeries that would affirm their self-acknowledged subjectivities, cisgender white feminists were looking for explanations that would prove that observed differences between men and women were social rather than natural. In doing so, people like Kate Millett, Anne Oakley, Andrea Dworkin, and Gail Rubin turned to the theories of Money and Stoller to advance the notion of sex and gender as distinct, with inequality being the expression of gender socialization, rather than proof of any innate differences. As contemporary theorists such as Jennifer German and Isabel Dahms have concluded, looking at the genealogy of gender reveals an unacknowledged sexual science history. However, this history remains remarkably cis. Despite the fact that trans and intersex folk are acknowledged as being the patients of these influential figures, these stories both reproduce trans people as either passive victims or at best wily benefactors of an otherwise anonymous clinical industrial complex. I don't seek to minimise the harm that these powerful men enacted on trans and intersex bodies. The Joan John case is well known, and there are many more trans and intersex children and individuals whose lives these doctors undoubtedly ruined. Moreover, the frameworks that these sexologists were working within was decidedly eugenicist. Benjamin, who had begun his medical career in Germany, was actively involved with eugenics research and institutions and brought much of the European interest in eugenics and plasticity to America. This then influenced John Money's work with intersex patients, leading Jill Peterson to conclude that Money's invention of gender was a form of race. However, in what follows, I will demonstrate that behind this cis story of sex and gender is a network of influential trans folk without whom Benjamin, Money, and Stoller's interventions wouldn't have been possible. Whilst this list is far from comprehensive, the first person I consider here is Virginia Prince. Prince was a pharmacologist who gained her PhD from the University of California at San Francisco in 1939 and later lectured there. However, what is important here is her twofold commitment, first, to creating a network of self-identified transvestites, and second, to educating doctors and professionals about sex and gender. She launched a publishing house, Chevalier Publications, to get the word out, authoring 3 widely consulted books on transvestism, and in her bi-monthly journal, Transvestia, her Virgin Views columns track her evolving theories of sex and gender throughout the 1960s and 70s. She presented these at academic conferences, in academic articles, and on worldwide speaking tours. Prince was a consultant to Benjamin and Stoller, among others, and Stoller interviewed her over a 29-year period as part of his research. Prince distinguished transvestism from homosexuality and transsexuality, and, according to Vern Ballow, it was Prince's definition of transvestism that was adopted by the DSM. Whilst her apparent homophobia and transphobia led her theories to be resisted by many trans people, both in her own time and latterly, Robert Hill, who has researched transvestia's gender community, believes that Prince deserves consideration as one of the most prolific and astute American theorists of gender in the 1960s and 70s. Second is Reed Erickson. Erickson was a wealthy trans man who believed in the positive potential of science to improve trans people's lives. He started the Erickson Educational Foundation in 1964, at a time when research into gender and sexual variance received very little funding, and provided the grants that enabled the research of Money, Benjamin, and Stoller to get off the ground. The EEF provided the entirety of the funding for the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1966 and the research of Money which took place there. Erikson wrote the foreword to Money and Green's Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment, and his perspectives fundamentally shaped the research in gender, which in turn followed the money. From 1969, the EEF sponsored a series of international and interdisciplinary symposia on gender issues, which led to offshoots, including the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association in 1979, now the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH. Almost every aspect of sex-gender research in the 1960s had Erikson's imprint on it. Neither sexual science developments or the feminism that borrowed from these would have been possible without Erikson's financing and visions. Finally, I end with the correspondences of Francine Logan-Dees, a less well-known figure in the development of sex and gender knowledges. However, she spent 7 years, from around 1968 to 1975, collecting information on trans folk throughout history, amassing an extensive bibliography, and sharing this with gender researchers. She had extensive correspondences with Vern Bullough and Jonathan Katz, two individuals who went on to be widely influential within sexuality studies. However, this was so ordinary to her that in her oral history with Susan Stryker, she doesn't focus on it, treating those 7 years as an interlude between her main work and her life's contribution, which was running trans-friendly bars. That her sex gender research and sharing was of less significance to her is evidence that much of the research into sex and gender that was taking place in the mid-20th century was taking place behind the scenes in what Sandy Stone calls the obligatory transsexual file, of which the scrapbook is one example. These are conflicted histories, and race and class privileges enable the interactions discussed here, and shape the perspectives of Prince and Erikson in particular, and the ones that they promoted. However, contesting the cis-story of sex and gender is important in restoring trans subjectivities to the historical record, and contesting the authority of either science or feminism over trans lives.